Welcome to Beyond the Fundamentals. Does regeneration precede faith, like Calvinists teach, or does faith precede regeneration, like non-Calvinists teach? We're going to talk about that right now. So we're talking about the idea of regeneration, and we want to get one thing straight right off the bat. Nobody ever picked up the Bible and started reading it and came to the conclusion just from Scripture that, hey, regeneration precedes faith. They never came to that conclusion just from reading Scripture. The idea that regeneration precedes faith, comes before faith, is a Calvinist idea. That's the idea that a person is born again or made alive of God before they believe the gospel, before they trust Christ, before they receive Christ. A Calvinist believes this must happen before they can believe the gospel. This comes from one of two places, and both of them are found in Calvinism. First place, it's introduced as an idea outside of Scripture to the young student of the Bible or to the young believer. This is what happened to R.C. Sproul. He admits in his own words in his book, and there's a web page that gives the idea. He walked in the seminary classroom and it was written on the chalkboard, regeneration precedes faith. Well, what's going to be the context after that? That's the context, not the Scripture. Of course, they put this idea in their head before they have any hermeneutical training, before they have any exegetical training, so as to plant the idea really before they're prepared and equipped to defend themselves against these kinds of ideas being planted in their head. So it can come from an outside place like that. It's just introduced by somebody else, or it can come from the necessity of other points of doctrine. That's how Augustine brought it into the church. Augustine came from Manichaean Gnosticism, and when he was debating against Pelagius, you had two wrong people. Pelagius was wrong and Augustine was wrong. And when Augustine was debating against Pelagius and trying to refute him, he actually went back to his Gnosticism, his Manichaean Gnosticism, to pull points to refute Pelagius. As a result, if you say Augustine had to be right, that necessitates that consequently regeneration must precede faith, must come before faith, if Augustine was right. And the question you have to ask is, was Augustine right? And when you come to the conclusion, no, he wasn't, then you're not a Calvinist. If you come to the conclusion that yes, he was, then most of those folks wind up as Calvinists. Our premise here is that Scripture is right, and that Augustine departed from Scripture when he came up with the ideas that he refuted Pelagius with. He built a system where you have to stack hypothesis upon hypothesis, and then you have results from it. So it can come from one of two places. It can either be a necessity of other doctrines that you have, which is what Augustine brought in, or it can be introduced as an outside idea. And Calvinism has both of those. Or a Christian that's exposed to Calvinism in church or in seminary is going to get it from both sides. It's going to be presented as an idea, and it's going to be introduced like stair steps. They're going to be introduced to a couple of other doctrines, and they're going to accept those, and then they're going to realize that regeneration must precede faith if those are true. Of course, they will accept the previous ones before they are equipped to properly examine them. So I got a few categories that I want to look at. One of the reasons we know that regeneration does not precede faith is because nobody in the Old Testament was regenerated. Genesis 15:6 still occurs when nobody's being regenerated. Ezekiel 36 and 37 is about the future. The second category is, like we already said a second ago, the condition only exists because Augustine's theological scenario demands it. The third category is that the Calvinist perspective is achieved by viewing obscure passages in light of a certain presupposition. And we'll talk about that in a second. There's only three possible kinds of passages of Scripture. Fifth thing, we're going to break down the passage in the New Testament that actually employs the word regeneration, which is Titus chapter 3, verse 5. There's three different kinds of passages. There are passages that are very clear, that very clearly state that faith precedes regeneration. There's many of those passages. There's multiple passages. There's a lot of passages where there's no order specified. There's a lot of those. And then when it comes to passages that very clearly state that regeneration precedes faith, 0 of those passages. Yep, that's right, not a single one. So we're going to look at this concept here. I have a chart. See this beautiful chart? Now I want you to pretend that this blue area, all the blue area represents Scripture, okay? And the correct way to interpret Scripture is to start with clear and plain passages, and then make your way to obscure passages and interpret the obscure passages on top. Interpret the obscure passages by using the clear passages. And then when you get over here to your presuppositions, hopefully you can eliminate those presuppositions and realize that they shouldn't exist. So let me give you an example of how this works. A Calvinist does this. And nobody ever picked up the Bible and started reading it and came to the conclusion just from Scripture that, hey, regeneration precedes faith. They never came to that conclusion just from reading Scripture. What happens is they start with a presupposition. Like here's Calvin. And so they're going to start over here. No Scripture. This is hilarious. Notice there's no Scripture and all they see is Calvin. And then they're going to move into the passages that do not specify whether or not faith or regeneration comes first. And if you look at those passages just right, you can kind of see Calvin through them if you look at them just right, you know? But then when you come over here to the passages that are very clear about the order in which these things occur, you can't see Calvinism at all. But that's how they look at Scripture. They start over here with Calvinism, then they move through the passages that don't specify, what we'd call the obscure passages, and then they use those two premises and impose those onto the clear passages of Scripture. Now, the correct way a Bible student is supposed to do things is you want to eliminate your presuppositions. So once you identify what your presuppositions are, you want to get rid of them. And the way you do that is you start with clear and plain Scripture. And you use the clear and plain Scripture, sometimes we call that the classical passage on something, and then we're going to move to the passages that aren't as clear and plain about a particular thing. And we're going to use the clear passages to interpret the obscure passages. And then when we move over to our ideas that we held, hopefully we can identify what they are and get rid of them and just stick with the Scripture, stick with these ideas that we started with in the clear and plain Scripture. So that's what we want to do. We want to start with clear passages, interpret obscure passages in light of the clear passages, and eliminate presuppositions.
And drop Calvin on the floor.
Drop Calvin on the floor. The way Calvinism is derived is you start with presuppositions, you interpret obscure passages in light of those presuppositions, and then you use those presuppositionally interpreted obscure passages to overrule and eliminate the clear passages. That's how Calvinism is derived, and that's how they make it seem scriptural. They're using the Bible, but they're not following the Bible. They're approaching it from completely the opposite angle from which Scripture should be approached. Now here's a moment of revelation. If you've ever been presented with a passage of Scripture that makes you think, oh, this passage kind of supports Calvinism. This incorrect method has been used to brainwash you into thinking that way, whether you realize it or not, whether you're conscious of it or not, whether you're a Calvinist or not. Many non-Calvinists get presented with passages like, I wonder how that should be explained in a non-Calvinist way. What has happened to you is this incorrect approach to Scripture has happened to you, even though you don't believe in Calvinism. The Calvinist idea was what was started with, and then that has shaped and colored and tainted the passage of Scripture so that you see it that way, rather than a correct hermeneutical method. So anytime you have a passage of Scripture that seems kind of troubling to you, this is what has happened in every single instance. Following a correct hermeneutical method will clear it up every single time.